being released from our schedule of meeting Tuesdays and Thursdays, and indeed being freed from almost all scheduling since we're supposed to be home for the most part, it's at least given me an opportunity to experience time differently. If we think back to the discussion of thought time versus money time, in a sense, we've been released from money time. Our when we engage with this material is now up to us. And so if there is a bright side, it's given us an opportunity to perhaps re-experience ourselves, re-experience our thinking, our study habits, our engagement. The downside, of course, is that we are not present to one another, and I really do think that education depends upon material co-presence, as Corral and I argued in the last paper that we discussed. The final 4 sets of readings I really hoped we were going to be together to discuss, especially these 2 today from Bell Hooks, because the philosophical content of these 2 sets of readings, I'm going to deal with both sets of readings together in this one video, but the philosophical content, I think, would have best been brought out by engaging with each other, because both sets of readings ask all of us to reflect upon where we are coming from and to allow where we are coming from to be confronted by people who are coming from a different space. Now, that especially concerns the need of white heterosexual males like me, this particular professor, to be open to being challenged by different perspectives, feminist, anti-racist, and so on. So some of that life that I hoped would have come out in actual political and philosophical encounters in the classroom space through our discussions is probably not going to be simulatable in this environment. Nevertheless, presumably you're still talking to other people through your social media networks. So perhaps you can bring some of this material to bear if you are talking about anything political, anything philosophical, if you're continuing to think through the issues of the course. So perhaps not all is lost. My comments are going to be fairly general. I want to kind of open up the issues rather than go through the text step by step. So there were 2 sets of readings. The first concerns what Hooks calls engaged pedagogy. I'm going to talk about that first. And the second 2 papers concern the feminist classroom and what that might mean. So I want to talk about the engaged pedagogy under the rubric of what the limits of institutionalized education are. We were talking last day, my notes last day concerned the school, the university in particular, as a contradictory space. On the one hand, serving purposes of socialization and inculcating hegemonic ideas, but on the other hand, insofar as it's an actual educational space, and enabling people to become questioning critical agents or subjects in Freire's sense. Hooks' conception of engaged pedagogy goes beyond even that. In fact, she notes, and this is page 15, right, the second full paragraph, progressive holistic education, she writes, is more demanding than conventional critical or feminist pedagogy. For unlike these 2 teaching practices, it emphasizes well-being. That means that teachers must be actively committed to a process of self-actualization that promotes their own well-being if they are to teach in a manner that empowers students. So her influences here are Freire on the one hand, and a Vietnamese Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh, whom I've not read, on the other. But the question I pose to you is, to what extent can self-actualization of this spiritual form take place in a university classroom? Whether we're talking about philosophy or women's studies or chemistry, is it the place for self-actualization? Is the spiritual, the holistic spiritual health of students and professors a possible goal in an institutionalized environment? And that's a really good question. And at first, when I first read this essay, my reactive response was absolutely not. I can't guarantee your spiritual health or my spiritual health. I'm so spiritually unhealthy. How can I help you? In any case, that's not what I'm here to do. One might think that philosophy cultivates the whole personality, but it perhaps puts us in a position to dispose ourselves, to relate ourselves differently to the world. But when you leave the classroom, that's up to you. How can I, or any of us, make ourselves more integral and whole through a process of education in an institutionalized space? So I initially reacted negatively and critically to the very idea. And though that reaction may have been correct, I don't know. I posed that as one challenge to you to think about that. But then as I thought more about it, I thought, well, perhaps I'm projecting certain prejudices I have about the idea of spirituality and holistic personality development and self-actualization in that spiritual sense. Maybe I was projecting a kind of new agey sensibility onto it that I dislike, but which isn't actually there in Hooke's essay. Perhaps what she means is that even in an institutionalized space, if we think of education as a process of moving from various forms of imposed objectification towards agency of subjectivity, that's what she means by holistic and progressive education. It's not the inculcation of a particular political perspective, feminism or Marxism or what have you, right? Rather, what it is a changing perspectives on ourselves so that we begin to see the ways in which how we have developed has been one-sided, constricted, and constrained. And so if we become educated, it's not that we necessarily become conscious of our manifold connections to all things and all things to us, and we feel an integral part of the universe as a whole, right? It might mean that. But maybe what it means in a less, a less quote-unquote spiritual sense is maybe what it means is that we recognize the particularity of the influences upon us, the one-sidedness of our perspectives, and the need to open ourselves beyond those, right? To be addressed by other people, to be addressed by nature, to be addressed by other living things, right? To take them into more comprehensive account. And if that's what she means, then it connects up. I'm not saying she's simply repeating things that Dewey said or Freire said or McMurtry said, but rather is giving us another way of thinking about education as growing towards more comprehensive levels of understanding, deeper levels of understanding, the capacity to think critically about ourselves and where we have come from, and therefore being more open to growing when we are challenged, right? The really crucial practical aspect of this first set of ideas is the importance of risk and challenge. So again, let me just, a couple of key passages from the text again. Sorry, this is the bottom of page 32 onto the top of page 33. Some folks think that everyone who supports cultural diversity wants to replace one dictatorship of knowing with another, changing one set way of thinking for another. This is perhaps the gravest misperception of cultural diversity. Even though there are those overly zealous among us who hope to replace one set of absolutes with another, simply changing content, this perspective does not accurately represent progressive visions of the way commitment to cultural diversity can constructively transform the academy. Right? So it's not as though a culturally diverse space or a politically diverse educational space is just throwing together a bunch of different ideas that challenge and reject the hegemonic ideas. Right? It's not substituting one hegemony for another. It's awakening people who took those hegemonic ideas as normal and natural and the only truth, confronting them with other truths, not so that one is then eliminated entirely, but precisely so its partiality is recognized. It's one part of a greater whole. We cannot understand the world, the human world, right, historically, culturally, politically, economically, socially, unless everyone who has a voice is allowed to speak it. This is a point we've made before. So when we think of that personally, right, we are growing beyond our initial limitations. We are recognizing that there is more out there than our own ego, than our own desires, than our own way of thinking about things. And if that's what she means, then I think the institutionalized educational space can help promote that to the extent that it encourages and enables people to share their perspectives, to make their arguments, right? Now, curiously, given where we're at culturally, safe spaces and whatnot, right? The classroom as a safe space, the university as a safe space, Hooks explicitly rejects that. She thinks the classroom has to be a space of risk. Now, it can't, when she says it has to be a space of risk, she doesn't mean that the professors should be up there prodding people to tell their stories, right? In fact, in the second set of readings, when she's talking about the observation of some professors that black students tend to be reticent to speak, she says, if they're reticent to speak, you have to understand why that is, because they've come from a culture that has regularly silenced them, right? And it's not it's not the function of the professor, whether black or white, to stand up and say, you speak for culture X and you speak for culture Y. The risk is not the same as prodding people to talk if they don't want to talk. But the risk that she thinks is essential to education and is essential to the diverse classroom is a risk that we have to allow ourselves to take, not so much to speak as to listen. Right? Listening is such an underdeveloped skill. Right? It's such an undeveloped cognitive capacity. By listening, by actively listening, you realize what you do not know. You realize that the set of truths you take to be universal might not be. And therefore, the risk is that you now have to grow beyond that. How? There aren't necessarily any rules. Right? Think back to Dewey. Education is not just learning how to apply the rules. That's one dimension. But sometimes we have to learn to do things without the guidance of rules. Right? That's where the growth happens. But that's scary. Right? We occupy unfamiliar territory. Right? Part of what's frightening, at least to me, about the current situation is that there aren't obviously any sets of rules. Right? It's easy to shut a society down. Is it going to be so easy to start it up again? That's frightening. Right? To some extent, we are in unknown territory. And we're all going to have to be involved and critically engaged in inventing new sets of rules because we haven't been in this situation before. That's a risk, right? That's a risk. We have to act, but the ground on which we stand is uncertain. So that can be accomplished. Right? I'm not sure that the educational classroom is, the institutionalized classroom is equipped to ensure the spiritual growth of students and professors in terms of emotional health. How would I evaluate whether people's emotional health has improved through a class in philosophy? I think that's up to you and to me, right? Our spiritual health, so to speak, has improved if we are more disposed towards thinking critically, to being open to being wrong, to being willing to learn and to grow. But that's not something I can write an exam about, right? So this means that the ultimate value of education is realized beyond the evaluative mechanisms of a particular class, right? And that if you've actually learned anything in a class, it's not going to be reflected in the essay or the exam. It's going to be reflected on how you carry yourself throughout your life. Right? Does it change how you relate to other people, to the wider world? Does it broaden your capacity for appreciation, for evaluation, for appropriate criticism, for listening? Right? And that's what it means to become a spiritually healthy person, to use Hooke's language. It's not necessarily the language I would use, but so what? Right? My language doesn't have to be normative. That's part of the point of her argument. The second two essays concern feminist practice in the classroom. I'm going to say rather less about that because I think the important points she makes have to be thought through by each of you on your own. But let me say a few things. First of all, the first essay, you might think, why was that even on there? It's mostly a kind of almost an autoethnography of her own experiences as a black woman in the feminist movement. And I suppose if we were looking at this from the perspective of social theory, it's an interesting reflection on what is typically called intersectionality, right? And Hooke's argument is that the feminist movement has traditionally been a movement by and for white women in which many black African American women have not felt comfortable and have not felt included because the power relationships that typified the relationship between white women and black women outside of the feminist movement, in particular sexual relationships or sexual questions around relationships with white and black men. This has really colored the way in which black women have interacted or participated in the feminist movement. What does that have to do with the philosophy of education? Well, I think it has to do with this. Education doesn't just occur in the classroom, right? Politics, political engagement, or lack of political engagement, or the reasons why people don't engage politically, that's part of our education, right? And it's a distinct form of education. It's an education that occurs through our experiences. And we can learn through our own experiences. And then the question is, if those experiences are negative, can we share them with other people, other groups who are the cause of that negative experience in a way that allows them to acknowledge that they have been the problem? Part of the issue that Hooke keeps coming back to in that first essay on the feminist movement and feminist pedagogy is that lots of politically engaged white women had a very difficult time understanding how they were part of the problem, because they thought of themselves as critical, as progressive people. How can I be part of the problem? And it makes you defensive. I mean, I can certainly say I'm not a white woman, but I'm a white man who's been involved in quote-unquote progressive politics for a long time. And I know what Hooke is talking about from the other side. I know I have been very defensive when I've been criticized for the perspective from which I'm coming, because I don't think I'm coming from the perspective of a white man. I'm coming at it from the perspective of a Marxist or this or that. And so there's an easy universalism that Hooke is challenging. She's not challenging universalism as such, I don't think, but she's challenging the easy universalism of, hey, I'm progressive, so, get out of my face. I don't have those problems. That's the Republican, that's the reactionary's problem, not me, right? My being male, my being white doesn't matter because I'm committed to these values. But you're being white, you're being male, or what have you, does matter, right? It influences your interpretation of those values in relation to people who don't share your history and don't share your identity. And then you have to stop and listen. So that's the aspect of political education that I think is relevant to our work. It's relevant to connect it back to the question of the diverse classroom. That has to be a politicized space. You can't have people approaching problems from their own perspective and saying, I've never felt my voice listened to. That's politics, right? So politics comes into the classroom, but the classroom, so to speak, education, also is also operative politically, right? When we are politically active, we have to be learning from each other and learning from the situation. If one group thinks they have the right line, then there's no learning possible, right? There's dogmatism, there's closure, and therefore there's the perpetuation of different histories of oppression like sexism and racism, even within progressive movements, if the leadership of those movements doesn't stop and listen, isn't accountable to its own history, doesn't change itself, doesn't ensure that it gives way. right? That it allows different leadership styles, more diverse leadership, etc., and so forth. The second issue focuses on to what extent a classroom can be X. Does it contradict the commitment of the university to education to allow for a feminist classroom or a Marxist classroom or whatever? Right? Typically, the argument will be you can't have a feminist classroom, right, or an anti-racist classroom, because these are political strategies. We can't have. It would mean politicizing pedagogy in that problematic way that Giroux mentioned. What we need is the objective classroom, like the scientific classroom. But I think Hooke's point is that the scientific classroom, the chemical classroom, right? These aren't any more objective than the feminist classroom. The very objectivity that we attach to something like science or perhaps philosophy, right? We think that these are just dispassionate inquiries into the truth, not political. They are political. They are perspectival. That doesn't mean that the weight of an electron is somehow some white male conspiracy against alternative physics. No, that would be silly, right? We can, of course, have some sort of knowledge of nature, but the natural scientific approach to nature is one way of approaching nature, right? It has an institutional history, right? And that has implications. So the feminist classroom is no more a threat to philosophy or sociology or political science than chemistry is to philosophy or political science, right? The feminist classroom is not an attempt to dogmatically reprogram everybody, as it is sometimes caricatured by its opponents. What it is ensuring that a relevant perspective on the whole is taken into account, right? So if we read a novel from a feminist perspective, we're going to disclose aspects of that novel that we wouldn't see if we looked at it from a different literary approach, right? If we look at the history of philosophy from a feminist perspective, we see, in addition to what is said, all sorts of other things that aren't said and couldn't be said, because a certain way of enunciating philosophical truths was taken for granted, which suppressed or drew attention away from the fact that it was not a universal perspective. So if there's going to be a universal perspective, we have to grow beyond partialities. And we can only grow beyond partialities if we take steps, institutional steps, to ensure alternative perspectives are developed, oppositional perspectives are developed. We can then get a greater whole. We're not going to reduce the number of perspectives from one to a different one. We're going to, hopefully, eventually develop into a more comprehensive, more adequate understanding of the complex whole, right? So I think that's the issue. The feminist classroom is not an attempt to eliminate all other perspectives, right, and say this one is true. It's to say, here are truths that have not been allowed to be enunciated before, and they need to be, and what are you going to do with them? Right? How can they be integrated? Does something have to be replaced? But those are all open questions that cannot be answered unless the perspective is allowed to be shared. So one further passage from the text, page 105. Right, right in the middle of the page, in the essay "Holding My Sister's Hand," without our voices in written work and in oral presentations, there will be no articulation of our concerns. Where are our books on race and feminism and other aspects of feminist theory, works which offer new approaches and understanding? What do we do to further development of a more inclusive feminist theory and practice? And we could substitute feminist theory and practice with philosophy. What do we do to ensure more inclusive philosophy? If philosophy concerns itself with understanding the fundamental principles and values of human life and our place in the whole, then it can't answer its questions if it doesn't listen to half of humanity. If it simply assimilates that half to the dominant perspective, which pretends to be the whole but has not been. So those are the stakes of these essays. I think I'll leave you with two questions. A, to what extent do you agree with Hooke's argument that the classroom must be a politicized space, right? But that in being politicized, it doesn't mean necessarily, dogmatically imposing one set of truths in favor of another. So that's the first question. And the second question, to what extent have you experienced education as a process of spiritual growth in her sense? Or do you think that that is a misplaced idea? I will be back in a couple of days with my final set of comments on the last two essays, so stay tuned, and I will let you know when they're up through the Blackboard site.